Hello and welcome to Calm the Pharm podcast, where pharmacy business meets legal wisdom, minus the headache. In each episode, we share practical legal tips and real-life examples to help you run your pharmacy with confidence. I'm your host, Sarah Stoddart. Thanks very much for joining us. A few weeks ago, we spoke about when you should tell your staff you've sold. Today, we're going to talk about managing staff during the business sale. So this earlier episode on when to tell your staff you've sold related only to that giving of notice, terminating their employment as a result of the sale. Today's episode is looking at managing your staff generally during a business sale, and in particular, your legal obligations when ownership changes. Now, that process actually starts at the contract negotiation stage, because in your contract you will have clauses relating to the employees. Those clauses might, for example, be when the buyer can interview the employees. Now, that is a condition or clause that is very much in favour of the buyer. So it may be that unless your buyer has proposed that clause, that one might not be in your contract, but more commonly we are seeing that in there. There will also be clauses relating to entitlements and what the adjustments are to be. Now, as a seller, this means that the adjustments for employee entitlements, and I'm talking about sick leave, annual leave, and long service leave, they are amounts which usually come off the purchase price at settlement. So if you have agreed to a purchase price of $1 million, but your employee entitlements are $50,000, then you're going to get $950,000 at settlement. Now, the reason for this is because when the staff, presuming they transition over to the buyer, when they take leave, the buyer is going to have to pay them that leave, albeit that the buyer wasn't the owner at the time the leave was accrued. Therefore, you're essentially allowing that amount to the buyer so they can pay the leave when the staff take it. Now, that's fine for annual leave and long service leave, and I'll talk about why. The reason why the adjustment for long service leave and annual leave is fine and not questioned is because if you had terminated the employee whilst they were under your employment, or they had left employment with you, you would have had to pay them that entitlement anyway. So annual leave is paid out on termination of employment, and long service leave is paid out in some circumstances, but not all. And that is why when it comes to long service leave, we only usually pay out on settlement when there is a staff member who has worked 5 years or more, or it might even be 7 years or more. And the reason for that is because those staff are more likely to go on and actually accrue that entitlement to the point of it being paid out. So that is why those adjustments are not really ever questioned, because you would have had to pay them anyway. When it comes to personal leave, though, and that sick leave, there is often a negotiation around reducing the amount that contractually you would be otherwise required to pay. So a seller in a contract is normally required to pay 70% of the accrued entitlement to personal leave. Now, when acting for a seller, we do try to reduce that amount, ideally to 35% or sometimes 50%. And the reason why we do that is because personal leave is only paid out when the staff member actually takes that leave entitlement, and it is not paid out on termination of employment. Therefore, if you've got staff members that are very healthy and very rarely take personal leave, you wouldn't be required to pay them personal leave. When you sell the business, if you then have an adjustment for personal leave for those staff, it can be viewed as a windfall gain in favour of the buyer, because they're essentially getting a discount to the purchase price of an amount which they may not have to pay to the staff. So that comes in at the contract negotiation stage, and you need to look carefully, if you're a seller, at your contract to see what adjustments need to be made. Also at the contract negotiation stage, but also as a requirement by law, is the process of offering employment. So your contract will set out, usually, that the buyer needs to recognise the service of the employees with the seller and predecessors. So this means that if a staff member has been working for 11 years, the buyer must recognise that, and when they transition over to the buyer, they've got a service period of 11 years. Now that is relevant for a number of employee entitlements, including personal leave and long service leave. It's also relevant for redundancy. The law also requires buyers to offer employees employment on terms that are no less favourable than their current terms of employment. So they can't just go changing their pay rate, for example, or putting them on probation if that would mean it's less favourable to them. By all means, they can increase their pay, but they certainly can't decrease it, or decrease hours such that the employee would end up with less pay at the end of the week. Perhaps they could decrease hours if the employee was still receiving the same amount in their hand, but otherwise they cannot. So this is all in your contract. And when it comes to managing your employees throughout the sale, you need to make sure of a few things. One, at the settlement stage, that the adjustments are calculated correctly. So as the seller's solicitor, they'll be requesting your schedule of employee entitlements so they can calculate those adjustments. So making sure that is done properly. Number two, making sure your contract is clear and you are clear on how the offers of employment will be made, and where possible, checking that they are made in accordance with both the contract and also by law. Thirdly, if there are to be interviews, making sure they're conducted at the appropriate time, and importantly, that you have actually spoken to your staff about the sale before those interviews take place. Fourth, you also need to manage your employees' emotions throughout this process. And I spoke about that in the episode about when to tell your staff you've sold. But staff do become emotional, sometimes unsettled during the sale process. That is because they're not sure if they'll be offered employment, and if they are, whether they're happy with who's coming into the business. So really making sure you're managing the timeframes and emotions around the process. The other thing that might come into your negotiations at the contract stage is whether or not the buyer is required to offer everyone employment in the business, or whether they have a right to choose. Now, more often than not, buyers do have a right to choose, but if possible, sellers do try to say that they have to offer everyone employment, or at least the key staff members. That is obviously to protect the employees, particularly if the seller has a strong relationship with them, but also to protect the goodwill of the business, particularly around those key employees. So managing staff is a really difficult part of the sale process. There is a lot to consider, and those considerations basically start right at the start of transaction and go right through to the end. So it is important to be properly advised on these matters and make sure you're not doing something which might compromise your contractual position, or more importantly, your relationship with your staff. That's all for today. There's a lot to take in. Of course, any questions or comments, please drop them below. And if you are enjoying Calm the Pharm podcast, we would really love it if you would subscribe or share it with your friends in the industry. Look forward to speaking to you again soon.